I think one of the really important things about the creative arts is originality.
Even people don't understand the dialect, of course, they can read the subtitle, but still they were deeply touched by the emotion, by the authenticity, by the history, by the real connection. They need real touching storytelling.
This time they can just be friends. They can be there can be loyalty, there can be friendship, there can be many, many different types of friendships.
It had the wind in its sails, and it was a bit, I think, a little bit zeitgeisty. People were ready to hear the story.
Can you imagine? A slow-paced family drama becomes the blockbuster for the super speed China. What is the secret behind this, and what does it say about China today? Think about all these people from Chaoshan when they traveled to Southeast Asia to work as migrant workers, earn very minimum wage with tremendous pressure and, inner struggles and competitions in a very different culture. So a lot of the things reflect upon that, and the whole story is based on that. Qiufan, in Chaoshan, I know almost every family knows or have, or at least know, that someone whose ancestor was, migrant workers to Southeast Asia or the United States or Europe. So how is that part of history being reflected? Is the movie authentic in that way for the locals?
After watch the film, I actually revisit the museum for collecting all these letters back in my hometown. So basically, you can tell. Of course, the
It's called
film have
Qiaopi,
been
isn't it? The letters
Qiaopi
are called
is the
Qiaopi.
Qiaopi, right?
Yeah.
So the film, of course,
The two words meaning
Qiao,
immigrant, right? Overseas
immigrants
immigrant.
and
Yeah. P
yeah, and
means
letter
writing. Yeah.
writing. So I mean, of course, the film, the story have been, romanticized. The history is, of course, obvious, way more brutal, way more bloody in your imaginable way. But I mean, the most important part, I mean, is through the writing, the beautifully, simply written letter, which repeatedly appear in the film, right? Through reading, through the characters, and even through the teaching. So it's the beauty of the Chinese actually reflect a lot of, like, deeply connected, memories and all this lineage and also culture, even through a very diasporic time. So I think this is what has been, represent so smartly in the film, like repeating all this, half modern, half ancient written Chinese, even in a very simple way, but through, different characters reading in a very soft, very, tender voices, and with this beautiful shooting, oceanic scenario, in the background. Obviously, it evoke a very deep, profound emotion, not only to the character, to the story, but also to the culture. As a Chinese, you feel you're part of it, you're part of the history. And I think this is what the movie did right about it.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I really agree with that because it was the most, in fact, to me, the most moving thing about the movie was the text, was the letters, was
Yes.
the words that were being used. I think one of the moments that really moved me more than anything else was when she was standing in line in the post office, like trying to waiting for to have her letter delivered or written, and there were all these other men all there waiting to have their letters written. That, and then so you realize that how important that yeah, it was really the text that helped. That was, yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt your train
No,
of
and the
thought.
director actually did a lot of research on the actual letters. Remember, there's a
Hmm.
man, like, his daughter was kidnapped, and he asked for pay back the ransom as soon as possible. That was the real letter. I found it in
Yeah.
in the museum. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was very
Hmm.
Uh,
touching.
Yeah.
later in the movie, they show the different letters, the original Qiaopi. I have a number on hand, actually from 1864 to 1980, over 30 million Qiaopi letters were received nationwide here in China. And you can imagine every of those letters, there's a story or two behind it. The Qiaopi letters, they are not only letters, but also money was being sent in the envelope home. So it is. So when you imagine that you receive a letter from your loved ones, and with which also carries the resource you need to depend on for your life, it carries both meanings. Sometimes the love is not necessarily expressed only in words, but also in the hard work with which the cash carries behind. It's not legal, by the way. It's not legal anymore when you put money into the letter, into the envelope. But during the difficult days in China, people living in big cities, the relatives, sometimes would put 20 or 10 kuai into the envelopes to their relatives living in some of the least developed areas, when they are also sending the letter. So that to me is not ancient. It just reminds me of something happened in my childhood. I saw people do that.
So just a personal story where, we think that this was maybe hundreds of years ago, like in this movie, but in fact, as you say, not only is it current, but it's also very universal. Obviously the Chinese did it a lot, but a lot of traditional cultures and were sending money home. Like my father's was, basically, the family came together and gave him the very little money they had to send him to study abroad in the Navy. And when he was there, he was expected to send money home, and he did. In those letters, those remittance letters, he had to send every month money home, because they were expecting it, and they were depending on it. So
Yeah.
so I think it's very important to remember. I think when you look at social media and with there criticisms of this film, where we're just basically talking about, oh, this only happens in China, but obviously humans are basically all the same.
On
Yeah.
the when I worked on my Titanic film, we actually solved the mystery of whether or not one of the main characters was on Titanic because of his Qiaopi
Oh,
letters back home. One of the
oh, tell us
letters
more about
had
it.
been, well, one of the letters that one of our central characters who we knew at the time of Titanic's, his name was Fang Lang, but it turned out his name eventually settled as Fang Rongshan or Fang Wingsun, living in the U.S. in Chicago. He had been sending money remittances back to his family regularly back in Taishan, back on Xiaoshan-dialect in the south of China, just off the coast of Guangdong. And in one of those letters, he sent a poem. That was the only time we found on record of him relating his experience surviving Titanic, about being in the water, being pulled out of the water. And that was in I think, a 4-line poem, 7-syllable, 7-character line. And that
Wow.
was where the mystery was solved. So sometimes these Qiaopi, and I've read thousands of Qiaopi letters when we were working on that film from all over. And that sense of what it means to be someone who has to be so economical for obvious reasons you've just mentioned with words,
Right.
but to say so much in so few words, I think is something that, like, diaspora communities all over the world can relate to, whether it's money or a poem or 5 words
Yeah.
that say how much you miss somebody. I think that's a kind of, we talk about the specific and the localized, the Chaoshan community, but that's a universal experience of most immigrant communities. In fact,
Yeah.
I say
Yeah.
one thing. I just throw this in here because I just think it's an interesting thing. My one misgiving, and I don't know whether this is something we should bring up, but my one misgiving, the one moment that sat a little uncomfortably for me in the film, was a thing that for me turns up in many immigrant communities, which is often the troubles that are caused for immigrant communities are caused by official uh, obstacles put in the way of settling, for example?
I am very interested in Qiaopi itself because Arthur, you said earlier that you've been reading hundreds of them, and I believe so, because in order to do your movie earlier, The Six, which is about the migrant workers, those were on the Titanic when the boat sank, you try to went back to their lives in order to find out exactly what happened, and to make sure that the world knows on the boat there were also Chinese migrant workers, and their lives matter, to put it in a political slogan. Anyway, so tell me more about what did you find out about the Qiaopi? What were some of the plots in the movie that reminds you of the research that you have been doing? Through Qiaopi, how better do you know not only that time, but also how maybe Chinese think, or the so-called Chineseness? Tell me if my question is too culturally stereotyped.
I'm going to come back to this as a filmmaker. I mean, the issue is always, I mean, try and think of a great film about a writer. It's very hard to do. I mean, maybe The Naked Lunch or something like that. It's hard to make films about writers because painters do things in front of you and throw paint around, but writers sit there with typewriters or do things by hand. And I thought that it was done very well in the film. The Qiaopi scenes, the post office, the writing down. How do you make words into something that's filmy? The thing about the Qiaopi that's fascinating, and we use them in the film as well. We featured them, visually we put them in the film, is that they are so condensed in form that they turn huge stories into a few lines. They turn someone's death into a single line of text, or a chengyu, some kind of idiom, and the implication is that somebody has passed and we miss them, or whatever it might be. That condensing of life experience is so rich and so allows such interpretation. I think it's a very filmy thing because it gives you the minimal information, then asks you to fill in what it means. So it's something when we were making The Six that was incredibly powerful to me. Of course, it also helped me that I didn't have to read too much Chinese to understand, because there would be 16 characters would be enough. But often, ironically, it makes it harder to understand because there's so much going on. There's so much being passed on through those words. It's such a different experience to the one we have now, where you can really send 1,000 texts to try and explain the simplest thing, and they were sending one text to explain 1,000 complicated things. And that's a huge challenge. And I think you can feel the weight of that. And I mean, they're in museums all over, Chinese museums all over now. Thank goodness that they're available. But I do think they also contain stories, and in the end, one of the points about this is that communities get to tell stories about themselves, and that's a powerful act. The fact that these very private letters have become public in some cases and are becoming more available, and this film will go some way towards sharing that story and making people interested to look, I think is great. It's the kind of thing where you want to be able to buy a book of Qiaopi and read them and read them almost as literature. I mean, they have such depth to them. I think it works really well in the film. I think that was a challenge the director faced, and he did it really well.
Yeah, he did not go directly into the script itself, but rather to explain the story first and then bring out the script as the background to it. That is a beautiful way of doing it. Qiufan, I'm sure your family have Qiaopi.
Yes, but it might get lost,
What kind of things going through your mind as a writer when you are studying those calligraphies and the few words on a letter?
Well, it's a collective history. It's a collective memory, through time. So it feels like I'm time traveling, basically, through reading this very simple, condensed texts. Basically, you live through all this, suffering, challenging, painful, sacrificing, but sometimes hopeful lives, back in the time. When I was visiting the museum, I think, there's a ton of story has been unfolded and to be told to the world. And I think there are huge collection not in China. I think in America, New York, as I remember it, like UNESCO, they have a collection. So maybe they have like thousands of, hundreds of like Qiaopi in their collection. So I think, I don't know, maybe there will be a database like everyone can check, and maybe they can find their ancestor, their grandparents' generation, their writings. And I think,
Mm.
yeah, we need to, do something about telling all this story to the world. Yeah, it's untold stories.
Because my parents recently moved from London down, from the north of England down to London, and in packing up the house, they discovered my mom had collected over the years letters that I had sent back from China, and
Wow.
also letters that were sent to me during my college years,
Mm.
from friends as I left, and around that time, and I sat for about a day and a half reading dozens, maybe hundreds of
Mm-hmm,
letters.
mm-hmm.
It was an intensely moving, if not at some points traumatic. I'd remembered things differently in my own life. This is only 30 years ago than the letters revealed the truth to be. This is 30 years ago in my own life, and I'm misremembering things. I'm remembering that people didn't stay in touch when they did, for example, or I'd forgotten that I'd written to them. Family had written to me. My father wrote things to me. My dad now has Alzheimer's, has dementia, and so his memory is disappearing. These are precious things, and they don't just, it's not just that they reveal something that happened 100 years ago. A letter from 10 years ago can reveal things to you even though you read it at the time that you don't remember from that time, and it sparks a memory. You remember something. These are incredibly precious resources for us to have, whether it's about other people's lives and a community's history, or whether it's about your own life. Looking back, going through old letters can be a little traumatic, but it's also incredibly meaningful, and it carries a lot of information and knowledge and emotion that you may not have remembered.
No, it's like a time lapsing. So I used to, no, I'm still doing that. I wrote a letter to the next year. So when the next year, the same date, the platform, some system, they automatically send me a letter from the previous year. So
Oh,
I'll ask
okay.
myself something. Are you still dating with a girl? Are you still have trouble with somebody? What are you thinking? Are you working on something new? So you always like amazing, like see how you've been changed in only a year, right? Think about 10 years.
I was thinking about the letter I wrote to my pen pals overseas. When I learning English, everybody had some pen pal, and I really wonder what I wrote there. Whether that they will have the Tian Wei P or something. Arthur had his Arthur P, right?
Maybe what really impacted a lot of young people about this film is is these letters. The pace of the world has changed so much. Like nowadays, you could be on the other side, we could be on a Zoom call, and you realize the speed of things. Like you yawn, and this person on the other side of the planet yawns because you yawn. That's something very close and human, right?
Mm,
You yawn when the person next to you. But this happens now across the planet instantaneously because of these gadgets we have. Whereas only a couple decades ago, we were still writing letters. So the weight of those letters and what they carried, and how the speed of human life has changed,
mm.
is maybe that's why the young people all were stunned by it as well. Just like, oh my God, that's how it used to be.